Okay, folks, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the very amazing Dave Nickles, who, as many of you will know, is the convener of for DMT-Nexus in the community. He has worked on, it seems, many harm reduction projects in particular, and these include Cosmic Hair, Teal Conscious, the Bunk Police, and Open Hyperspace Traveller. It's obviously got a gift for gab and the way with words as well. He's offered fantastic cultural critiques, commentary on the psychedelics and radical politics, as well as novel phytochemical data for psychedelic preparations at venues ranging from conferences to festivals around the world. And he's also an avid glassblower, and he can often be found in his workshop at home. So I welcome Dave Nickles, and I'd like to introduce his talk, Thoughts and Perspectives on the Future of Unsanctioned Psychedelic Research. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you. So this talk is really going to pick up where my talk at Breaking Convention 2015 kind of left off. That talk was entitled Criminals and Researchers, Perspectives on the Necessity of Underground Research, and was inspired in part by comments from several sanctioned psychedelic researchers who essentially made statements about underground research not really being research, or underground researchers having perhaps a different idea of what research is, or just wanting to get high. And frankly, I don't think there's anything wrong with just wanting to get high, and I think that, some sanctioned researchers are probably have some of those similar leanings, but in looking at it, it seemed like the folks making these comments weren't actually aware of what was going on in the underground. So ultimately, the first question that comes up is, what is unsanctioned research? And by unsanctioned or underground research, I simply mean any sort of research endeavor that lacks typical institutional funding, that isn't being done through an academic institution, that lacks governmental grants, private research grants, things that are being done potentially illegally and without any sort of real backing. The question that then follows that is, why is it necessary? Don't we have all these institutions doing great work? And sure, absolutely we do. But at the same time, those institutions are limited as far as what they can ask, what things will pass an IRB or an ethics review panel. Not that I'm pushing for unethical research, simply that these are some of the constraints on research. Obviously, there's also institutional dogmas, groupthink. In the US, what it might take to get the necessary degrees required to pursue sanctioned psychedelic research could leave you with, 5 or 6 figures of student loan debt. These are realities that mean that it's not possible for everybody interested in psychedelic research to engage in sanctioned psychedelic research. The follow-up to that is ultimately, but you're criminals or you're engaging in illegal research, as if that somehow negates the actual findings of that work. The obvious response to that is that folks like Ricart at Hopkins have, engaged in pretty terrible research. In that particular case, he was studying the ties between MDMA and Parkinson's, used methamphetamine instead of MDMA, and was ultimately called out on it. Interestingly enough, he was being funded by NIDA, which is a governmental institution that has a vested interest in showing that drugs are harmful. Additionally, criminality is ultimately an arbitrary distinction. Criminality is determined by the state, which has various interests in subjugation of certain groups, which has its own agenda and particular systems and institutions seeking various goals. So deciding whether or not something is meritorious based on whether or not it's criminal doesn't seem to make much sense to me. I'll be talking about research taking place on the DMT-Nexus. The main areas of exploration that we engage in are phytochemical analysis, extraction techniques, the propagation of botanical specimens, harm reduction work, and crowdsourced data indexing. Now, for phytochemical analysis, I'm really not going to spend much time on this. I've given a number of talks at MAPS, at Breaking Convention, at the ayahuasca conference in Ibiza. All of those videos are available online. If you're interested in this work, I definitely recommend checking them out. I will say we've analyzed a wide variety of acacias, phalaris, mimosa, a number of plants used in ayahuasca, mushrooms, cactus, and perhaps the most important thing is that we're currently soliciting submissions, particularly if you grow your own ethnobotanicals or if you have them growing wild around you. Now, obviously, we're not looking for things that are in precarious ecological positions, but if you have access to plants that you would like analyzed, feel free to talk to me after this presentation or send an email to the link that'll pop up at the end. Following analysis, we also engage in a lot of work around extraction techniques. Perhaps the main focus of that over the past 9 years has been the refinement of extractions in an attempt to simplify procedures, maximize yield, and increase safety to kitchen chemists at home. Beyond that, we've developed several methods for isolating DMT from other alkaloids. So in the US, we experienced a really severe crackdown on the availability of Mimosa hostilis and Mimosa tenuiflora, it's the same plant, root bark back in 2011, 2012. And so following that, people switched over to acacias, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. With certain acacias, you don't have as clean an alkaloid profile, and so some people still wanted to get pure DMT from these plants, and so methods were developed for that. Folks like Nen will be happy to extol the virtues of those total alkaloid fractions, and I would definitely encourage exploring those as well as DMT by itself. Additional extraction techniques that have been worked on include the refinement of Mansky, which is kind of a time-intensive, laborious process. We've got a few approaches to that that really minimize the amount of labor and time. And finally, and perhaps most interestingly, the development of so-called dry tech food-safe extractions, which utilize materials found pretty much exclusively in the supermarket. Things like pickling lime, vinegar, vegetable oils, ethanol, isopropanol. I mean, you can do a full extraction from plant material to finished product using literally things that you can pull off supermarket shelves. I think the exciting thing about that is it really presents, looking to the future, a model of extraction that really lies beyond any sort of law enforcement ability to interdict or otherwise control extraction, whereas we have seen issues around petrochemical solvents or sodium hydroxide, things like that. So I think that in addition to potentially providing some safer approaches, now you can't eat food-safe chemicals. We've had people do some pretty stupid stuff with that, but you know, it presents a certain amount of safety beyond some of the traditional approaches to extraction. Following extraction, botanical propagation has been one of the major areas of engagement at the Nexus. And actually, as this was exploding at the Nexus, we realized we had a problem where we were a community of folks who, some of whom had admitted to engaging in illegal acts, some of whom had questionable posts and content. And we realized that if folks were going to be sending plant material around the world using real addresses and things like that, it was best to have some separation. So we created a sister site called Share the Seeds. Over the past 4 or 5 years, Share the Seeds has kind of grown into a pretty impressive community of botanists located around the world. Folks on there are growing a variety of threatened and rare ethnobotanicals, including things like iboga, Diploteris cabrana. They engage in large-scale seed buys to help sort of spread some of this material around the world. Additionally, there are several botanists who have large plantations that have engaged in mass propagation of small cuttings to try to get some of these things out. One of the areas I'm most hopeful for around this particular model is that it presents a decentralized, non-commodified approach to spreading ethnobotanicals as well as these experiences. I think that rather than folks winding up buying questionable plants on eBay or from vendors who have routinely been shown to potentially engage in shoddy practices, it's really awesome to see this community develop that has this level of knowledge and willingness to pass plants on. I would recommend folks here check it out. I know y'all have some crazy export laws, but it's probably worth a look. I'd also like to take a moment and comment on the necessity of harm reduction. Personally, I think harm reduction is an essential part of underground research. I think there's really no getting around the fact that if you're engaging in kitchen chemistry or if you're making or taking your own substances, you have to be aware of what you're doing and what you're taking. And with that being said, I think there are sort of differences in practice between harm reduction, say at home, between extractors and psychonauts, and then the way that that information or that knowledge base is deployed in the field. So looking around the community, there are folks who have really impressive knowledge when it comes to pharmacokinetics and substance mixes and what's safe, what's not safe, what could potentially be overwhelming. And yet in a festival context, right, you don't really need to explain to somebody what's going on if they take harmala alkaloids and MDMA. You just need to explain that, you know, serotonin syndrome's a really shitty way to die and that they probably don't want to do that. And so sort of seeing how that information can be deployed, I think presents an impetus for folks who have that knowledge to put it out there and to figure out ways to make it digestible and shareable with the rest of the community. Because ultimately, harm reduction is necessary for the dissemination of psychedelic culture. And by that, I mean that psychedelic culture rests on the psychedelic experience. It rests on being able to have these experiences and come in contact with some of these spaces and values and people. And at the point where this is riding on the back of substances, some of which have potential for, you know, physical distress, some have potential for mental distress. If we're serious about spreading these things, we have to be serious about spreading them in relatively responsible ways that try to hold safer spaces for people to have these experiences and then to go on and keep putting it out there. With that said, just a brief note on the explosion in availability of DMT. That's really kind of the flip side of putting information out there, of making extraction that much easier to follow, that much more significant in its yields. We've seen an explosion in the availability of DMT, and it's certainly, you know, you can walk around pretty much any music festival and it's right there in your face. I think that that's led to a number of problems, not only in the actual number of people who are having difficult experiences, but people who are having difficult experiences because they didn't know what they were getting themselves into. And looking at where things were maybe a decade ago, you know, the notion of stumbling across DMT completely unexpectedly was maybe not anywhere near as common as it is now. And so I think understanding that this came from somewhere, that this came from a number of communities putting this information out there and making it so accessible. The flip side of that is that it requires engagement at this point to acknowledge what was done, the fact that that spread of information was necessary, and now it's necessary to engage with some of the fallout of that spread of information. So having sort of looked over the past, some current and future projects taking place at the Nexus include attempts to bridge the harm reduction and research gap, Cactus analysis along with natural product synthesis, some interesting mushroom experiments, and some crowdsourced psychedelic data indexing. So first, this video is of a collaborative project between the Nexus, the Bunk Police, reagent base, and energy control in Spain. And so what we've got going on here across the top, there's 4 columns. You can pick from 9 or 10 different reagents. And depending on the reagents you pick, it will populate the different fields. So you can compare up to 4 different reagent reactions at a time. This particular side of the table is showing reactions between pure compounds and the reagents. You can actually see, I hope it's visible, there's a short link to this full database as it stands here on the right side. And each of these images is essentially the preview of a YouTube video for this particular substance reaction. So the database includes pretty much any compound that we were able to source off the so-called darknet, all of the classic psychedelics, as well as a wide variety of research chemicals and other drugs. All of them have been confirmed by energy control in Spain using GCMS, I believe. And ultimately the goal was to put together a database that was practical and usable in the field. I mean, this particular website will resize to fit on a smartphone, on a tablet, on a laptop, literally whatever you've got. And we wanted to provide the end user with something that they could use to compare the reagent reactions they were seeing in front of them to a controlled standard of sorts. So right here we've got the substance reaction of MDMA and the marquee reagent. Takes place in real time. This is jumping into like 9 seconds in. You can see it's turned dark, it's fizzing. The videos play for about 1.5 minutes or so, and they give the full, basically until any sort of noticeable change ends. Now, like I said, this side of the table sort of runs with just the pure compound and a reagent. The other half of the table that we'll go to now is running that same reagent test over a thin layer chromatography plate that's already been run. The reason we decided to do this is because thin layer chromatography is super helpful for identifying, a given compound, but the actual reagent reaction that takes place looks a bit different than the pure compound, as you can see. Basically, the way the plate absorbs the reagent, you get a much duller reaction that then sort of spreads out. And so again, we wanted to give people a reference in the event that they were using thin layer chromatography to engage in analysis. And if you don't know anything about thin layer chromatography, the Nexus has a bunch of links, Bunk Police has a bunch of links, Syn Labs, which we'll get into shortly, has a ton of information, or you can just Google thin layer chromatography and find out a whole bunch. So this area down here on the right that we'll go into now is a bunch of different compounds and their commonly encountered adulterants or other substances that might be sold instead of those compounds. And we decided to put together this section of the database so that people could, at a glance, go through some of the reactions. If their reaction looked odd, or if they had reason to suspect they had been given something other than what they wanted, that sort of without having to page through the whole massive database and figure out maybe what they were looking at, that they could have the most likely suspects all grouped together. So again, the aim with this is really to give as much utility as possible to people in a festival or party or real world setting where they want some sort of additional certainty or additional engagement with the analysis that they're hopefully engaging in. Obviously, we're open to feedback on this. If people have other ideas, suggestions, critiques, we'd love to hear them. With that being said, I just mentioned Syn Labs. They've put together an app that basically takes that entire database and drops the YouTube component of it. And instead, it goes with gradients, color gradients that reflect that the change that you see with those reagents. And they've added in a whole variety of sort of encyclopedic information, things dealing with dose, effects, what combinations may or may not be safe, duration, toxicity. And really, this came out of a desire for having something that had even more portability than just the database. Whereas, in talking with DanceSafe about the database, they informed us that it wasn't always practical for them to have a connection and that they could only, an internet connection, that they could only cache so many videos before it got kind of overwhelming. So this particular app really does away with all of those hurdles and instead provides perhaps a slightly simplified approach in some ways, but something that we feel still offers pretty incredible utility. This particular app also includes a section on TLC calculating, so that if you have some sense of what compounds you've got, you can run some analysis on unknowns. You can have a sense of what the likely suspects are based on the height that it's running on the plate. Again, if you don't know anything about TLC, just take a look online. There's a lot of really great information. But yeah, ultimately this app was also designed to be compatible with doing most harm reduction stuff that you might want to do through the app. So you can order reagents through the app, you can contact energy control or other analytical labs through the app. And I believe this should be coming out within the next month or two. It might actually be a lot sooner than that, but I don't want to make incorrect statements. And as far as I understand, it will be entirely free. I know I said I wasn't going to spend much time on analysis, and I'll do my best to hold to that, but currently on the Nexus, we're engaged in a cactus analysis project that was born out of a desire for cacti eugenics. Essentially, a few people got fed up with the number of bunk clones that they felt were going around, and figured, given the analytical equipment we had access to, why not start analyzing some of the well-identified and commonly available clones to find out which were the most potent and then just propagate those. So this project started with 10 different specimens and quickly exploded into over 30 over the past months. We're also happy to accept samples being submitted for this project. Again, feel free to reach out after the talk or via email. Now, in running analysis on these, we realized pretty quickly that there were certain compounds that we encounter in Cactus that we didn't actually have reference standards for. So we were getting unknowns when we were running some of the analysis, which led to a couple of our chemists offering to engage in natural product synthesis for us. So essentially, because these compounds were either unavailable or rather expensive to source for the purpose of doing HPLC or GCMS testing, they offered to synthesize them, focusing mainly on phenethylamines and isoquinolines. I won't go into everything that they're currently working on, but ultimately the desire was to not only utilize them for our projects, but to then donate them to the analytical labs in question so that they could be used should other folks in the community submit Cactus samples, or if there was other valuable projects that they could go towards contributing results to. Those same chemists are actually working on a pretty interesting project involving psilocybe cubensis. People who are aware of the work that Gartz did a number of years ago, adding diethyltryptamine to mushroom substrate in the hope that it would be hydroxylated, and had success. These folks have determined that that procedure was straightforward enough for them to attempt with a variety of other tryptamines to reproduce some of those findings. This was also kind of kicked into gear after the recent paper on the discovery of the enzymes in cubensis that are responsible for that synthesis. So here are the compounds that they're looking at. Everything that has an asterisk on it is already underway. I'm hoping that we will see harvest in the next month or two and then analysis following that. So hopefully there will be some potentially novel tryptamines for analysis and potentially for development as either novel therapies or recreational compounds. The last project that I wanted to talk about is a psychedelic crowdsourcing project that I was hoping to have screenshots for it, but due to an unexpected family tragedy, the people working on this were not able to submit them. Essentially recognizing that one of the most beneficial things that the underground can provide to sanctioned researchers is anecdotal data and sort of raw form experience reports, information, phenomenology, things of that nature. And looking at the vast body of work that's already out there, we felt that it would be helpful to put together a well-indexed, anonymous database that would allow for sanctioned researchers to sort of easily flip through people's experiences, sort of collate some of the similarities, compare, contrast, engage in keyword searches, and other well-indexed means. So this is a project that's about 6 months underway at this point, and that we feel could really help looking at some of the projects like the Hopkins surveys, where there have been clear indications that researchers are interested in gaining some of this phenomenological insight. We felt it would be great to have a database where perhaps combing through that data could lead to researchers making statements along the line of anecdotal reports indicate that XYZ compound yields ABC results. Therefore, we are starting investigation into. And so ultimately, in light of what we see as potential in that arena, we would invite sanctioned folks to offer any sort of insight as to what would be most helpful with this. We're already in dialogue with several different groups, and we really would like to see this have as much utility as possible in the hopes of furthering that dialogue. Now, with that being said, looking to the future of psychedelic research, both underground and institutional, I think it makes sense to take a moment and talk about some of the hazards of institutional approaches. First and foremost is the reliance on entrenched political and economic infrastructure. This means that institutional researchers are ultimately dependent on government in order to function. They need to gain their schedule licenses. They need to make nice to the powers that be in order to conduct their research and remain in an appropriate light, and that ultimately their research is governed by who holds the purse strings and who they can woo and how that goes down. Additionally, there's the potential for consolidation and homogenization of approaches and perspectives within organizations. Now, obviously, underground research isn't immune to this either. Groupthink is a natural byproduct of spending time with people, or at least can be. But I think as we look at the medical model and the way that some of this plays out, it's important to ask questions about to what degree groupthink is going on, to what degree certain things are being highlighted or overly emphasized. I think it's also, along those lines, important to question the way that we as stakeholders in psychedelic community are all affected by what issues become dominant, how those issues become framed, who gets to frame those issues. And ultimately, by stakeholders, I mean that all of us here have some interest in the psychedelic community, in psychedelics, in what this world looks like. And so depending on how institutions grow and expand and potentially dominate the discourse, that affects what can and can't be brought up, or at least how it is or isn't brought up. There's also obvious questions of hierarchy, bureaucracy, and accountability. When there are NGOs and institutions that function as discrete units, they're going to take the actions that they need to take in order to conduct their agendas. We may have some ability to sway those based on our own actions in response to them, but ultimately we don't have anything to do with those if we're not a part of those institutions. So I think that there are good things to be aware of when we look at how some of these organizations operate, who they're engaged with, and how they're functioning. And so along those lines, I'd like to point out that institutionalization requires large-scale commodification. There's no way to have medical therapies without commodifying psychedelic compounds. Obviously, you can make the argument that to some degree they're already commodified, and you wouldn't be wrong. And at the same time, I think we have to ask questions about what large-scale societal level commodification looks like. I think we have to recognize that institutionalization implies legitimate authority, that ultimately that authority is derived from the state saying, hey, psychedelic medicines are okay, therefore you become the authority on this legitimate application. I don't think that that's actually justified. I don't think, when we look at the reasons why psychedelics have been criminalized or other compounds have been criminalized, there's not actually any legitimate reason for them to be unavailable to the populace at large. So suddenly declaring certain groups as legitimate because of the applications that they're proposing raises a lot of questions as to the whys. I think we also need to ask who are the gatekeepers in such a model. And as some of these places talk about mainstreaming psychedelics, we have to ask, what is the mainstream? What are the effects of mainstreaming psychedelics? And are the benefits, supposed benefits, what they're claiming? We also have to ask about the context and pretext for commodification and regulation. Who do these things serve in a commodified, regulated context? Who benefits from them? Who loses? And what are the broader effects on society? So by that, if we take a look at this particular quote from a for-profit correctional institution or correctional corporation in the US, we can see that there's a clear interest on the part of for-profit prison companies to make money off the incarceration of drug users, and in this case, so-called illegal immigrants. Now, it's not fantasy to imagine what happens if one of those populations dries up or starts to dry up. We've seen an explosion in the incarceration of immigrants and in the creation of for-profit immigrant detention centers in the US. So given that we already see the CCA moving in that direction to secure their profit, we see that there's a clear consequence, or at least some consequences, to legalization, to removing drug users from that criminalized pool. So even though earlier I said criminality doesn't matter, I think it does matter in the context of recognizing other populations with whom we have solidarity. So taking that, some of those instances and trying to look at institutions and research, I think it becomes apparent that applying psychedelic insights inherently goes beyond any sort of research, any sort of lab, any sort of at-home extraction. I think that some of the problematic statements made by folks in an institutional context don't really serve the community and create tension where there doesn't need to be any, although there are certainly places where tension exists. Ultimately, psychedelics are part of the cultural fabric. There's no getting around that. There's no undoing the 60s. There's no putting the genie back in the bottle. And so given that, I think we have to ask what coexistence looks like. In a research context, as I've pointed out, anecdotal evidence can easily inform sanctioned research. Ultimately, I think whether we're talking about sanctioned or unsanctioned researchers, there's a clear need for harm reduction. And even if you're working at an institution that operates behind paywalls, I would strongly urge you to consider open source approaches. Additionally, in some cases, cooperation is really straightforward and makes obvious sense. And I don't think, even if we have different ideological opinions, there's no reason why we can't work together to engage with some of those research opportunities. But that said, clinical research is not apolitical. The context and implications are incredibly significant. And this includes whether we're talking about microdosing LSD to function as a nootropic so that, investors in Silicon Valley can ensure that they get the most return on their investment by maximizing the creativity and workplace efficacy of their employees, or whether we're talking about providing material aid to the US military in the form of potential therapies to reintegrate their soldiers into society, and what the consequences are as far as US imperialism and militarism around the world. So when we consider unity in a societal context, I think we have to acknowledge that some research is inherently political and has potentially massive implications. I think that at the very least, this research deserves robust and communal discussions, and that ultimately we have to acknowledge if and when certain institutions begin to dominate the cultural landscape and ultimately frame what the discourse looks like. Ultimately, there might not be unity within the psychedelic community, and I think that's okay. I think that frequently people become afraid to air some of their grievances or differences or engage in some of these really difficult discussions for which there aren't good answers or for which there's really not even much discussion. Most of these political topics that I've mentioned will also be coming up in my talk tomorrow, as well as the one on Sunday. And so I'm hoping that we can actually get some solid conversation rolling on this, even if it's an absolute mess. Thank you.
Hi, David. I really appreciated what I felt was a really thorough deconstruction of the issues around legitimate research, particularly with regards to certain applications, becoming legitimized at the loss of other applications within the wider culture. I was just wondering what discussion and feedback have you gotten from people that are conducting in, so-called legitimate and authorized research? Do they see these approaches as complementary, competitive? Are they hostile towards the efforts, etc.?
Some people seem to love it. Some people seem to hate it. I have to say it's been really encouraging to encounter some institutional sanctioned folks who it seems could not be more enthusiastic about the work and seem really encouraging. I mean, people who I encountered ever since Nishay, hooked me up with a spot at Psychedemia a number of years ago, and just out of the gate, there were some really super helpful and enthusiastic sanctioned folks. Like I said at the beginning of the talk, there's also been some people who have been entirely dismissive, people who I would like to believe wrote it off because they weren't aware of what was going on and felt it was necessary to just make statements based on their own perception. But that said, it could have just as easily been that they disliked it, were disinterested, felt hostile towards it. We have had folks who have articulated a distaste for it, feeling that it's just not appropriate. Ultimately, that's fine that that's how they feel, but I don't understand why that would be a position given some of the clear merit that the research has, given that nobody else was in a position to analyze some of these plants, or people who were in positions to do some of the early analytical work. We analyzed stuff that had been collected early on by Schultes in the Amazon, In one case, he had a sample of Tetrapteris methystica that was collected, and he wrote about it in his, in his reports that his canoe capsized and he lost the sample. Well, whatever it was, 50 plus years later, we got a sample through the ethnobotanical marketplace, analyzed it, tried to find what was in it, and began to publish some of those results. And so I think that the research in many cases speaks for itself. I understand that it, may turn certain people off, but I also think that there's a lot there.
Thank you, Dave, for a great talk. And I have to say something as one of these evil sanctioned researchers. Firstly, I'm really, really supportive of underground work, absolutely, and I completely take your point that underground and anecdotal work is a really big fueler of research, because researchers can look at thousands of cases of anecdotal reports and they make good targets to do research. The difficulty is that when it comes to authorities licensing new medicines, you can slap onto their desk 100,000 anecdotal reports and it means absolutely zero.
Totally.
We have to go through the hoops of rigorous phase 1, 2, and 3 studies. It costs millions. There are no shortcuts. There's no other way of doing it. And I have a great many friends in the underground community, and they say to me, "Hey, man, you don't need to work with the man. You don't need to do this stuff. If your patients can come out to Esalen and I'll give them MDMA, and that's great for a few dozen people. But when you talk about the community, and we want to hold on to this for the community, my community is the 66,000 cases of untreated PTSD in the UK who need MDMA, licensed, legal MDMA. They don't want to go underground. They won't go underground. They don't want to break the law. They need to go into their GP practice and be given legal MDMA. And we just have to jump through the hoops, and it sucks. But I support what you're doing fully. And I really like what you say about working together and cooperating, because that way we're really going to get somewhere.
Sure, I take that point, and I appreciate the support, absolutely. I guess what I would throw out there is that, and I certainly don't mean any disrespect by it, but I think it depends on what sort of the end goal is in some ways. For me, I understand that these things have therapeutic applications, and for me personally, my first mushroom experience was worlds of relief. Was so much it still brings me to tears at times thinking about it. And yet at the same time, the question that comes up is therapies to what end, right? When we look around, when we see the world that we live in, when we see the way that capitalism functions, when we see the way that industrial society functions, when we see the systems that we're locked into, right? Do we have therapies so that we can integrate people back into these fucked up societies to keep doing the same garbage over and over and over again? Or do we actually try to engage in some sort of attempts to change things beyond that, right? I think the notion of adjusting people to these profoundly sick societies, right? Not to crib too much, but it presents some really alarming, potentially dystopian undercurrents to me. I think that I'm sure Rick's going to bring this up in a moment, but I think that looking at some of the stuff, looking at 1.3 to 2 million civilian casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan, looking at a drone program that's expanding and being used in increasingly illegal manners, looking at the fact that we have skyrocketing rates of PTSD among drone operators, to me, yeah, as individuals, each of those people should have access to anything that could possibly make their lives better, that could provide any therapeutic relief. And yet at the same time, what does it mean when the Department of Defense can turn around and tell the populace, hey, don't worry about all these people, we can reintegrate them back into society, no problem. We can bring them home, we can make them your neighbors. You don't have to think about it, and they're going to be fine. What is the fallout on a global level? What are the implications of being able to sort of spin that narrative? And like I said earlier, I don't necessarily have easy answers or any answers for some of these questions, But like looking at things like that, looking at the unchecked growth of Silicon Valley, I mean, looking at what's going on with Bitcoin at the moment and the explosion in its value and the electrical consumption of the blockchain, like, you know, considering how some of these compounds are suddenly shifting from what I see looking back to a period of time I didn't get to live through, as potentially upsetting the apple cart in ways that caused freakouts, even if some people think that the 60s counterculture was a mistake. You know, like, I think that there was a potential there that's being recuperated in really strong and serious ways, and things that I don't see discussion in this community about, and things that I'd like to see discussion about.
Well, David, I really appreciate the kind of focus on the shadow side of clinical research and the shadow side of working with the military. But I wonder, do you really think we shouldn't be working to do PTSD with veterans? And is that your sense that there's some trajectory there that shouldn't be done? And I'll just share that it seems like the kind of thesis that you have, that these are people broken by the cruelty of what they're doing, and then they get repaired, and then they just go back to keep doing it, or they go back to society. That doesn't seem to be what's happening. It seems that a lot of the people that have PTSD have what's called moral injuries. You know, they don't agree with the war themselves. They're trapped in that system as well. And so it seems like healing people from PTSD, healing military soldiers from PTSD, is contributing to a better understanding of the emotional consequences of that kind of warfare, and is actually making it less likely rather than more likely. So that's at least my perception, and I think it's really important and worthwhile to talk more about it.
So just to ask a clarifying question, when you say makes it less likely rather than more likely, are you referring to those individuals who've had therapy? Or are you talking about on a systemic level? Because if you're talking on a systemic level, I'd like to understand that assertion.
Yeah, both ways. So I think that you could make this case that any kind of new medical technology makes it easier to wage war, because now more and more people will be saved and not killed. And yet we also have more and more veterans who are, you know, disabled, who would have died, who now are alive and are able to kind of reflect on what happened to them. So I think that we're having an impact systemically. It's not so much making war easier, but what we're doing is making the consequences of war both more readily accessible, more readily communicable to people, and helping them work through their traumas of war, so that the veterans that we have treated seem to be less sort of gung-ho, I'll do whatever I'm told. And so that's how I think it has a systemic effect as well.
Sure. I guess I'm certainly not arguing against that. And, you know, something that comes up, right, is what is the propensity of somebody who's been through, like, their psychedelic therapy to want to return to the battlefield? Like, I don't, you know, you are obviously intimately acquainted with that in ways that I'm not. However, with that being said, there's two things. First is kind of an aside. I think that in the American context, right, talking about the troops becomes politically loaded for obvious reasons, right? This whole notion of support the troops and what supporting the troops means sort of places them on an interesting political landscape. But then beyond that, looking at what you're saying is the sort of systemic realization of the ills of war through treatment of veterans, I don't know that has any impact on American militarism. I don't know that has any impact on the actual attempts to secure resources, to project power. I mean, America is, and these are things that I have for my, for subsequent talks, but we can get into it now. Ultimately, like, as America falls from its global hegemonic position, like, it's attempting to project hard power in real ways all around the world. I mean, look at the recent death of troops in Niger, right? Like, people didn't even realize the degree to which the U.S. has infrastructure and troops deployed on the ground there, And so I don't disagree that there's a lot of benefit and merit in treating veterans, and that for those veterans themselves, you know, like I said, I hope that they find as much peace and therapeutic value as possible. But looking at things on the front end, looking at the actual political realities of how the U.S. operates in the world, what it attempts to gain, like, I think that there are really entrenched notions of American exceptionalism, of the degree to which might makes right, of the degree to which black, brown, non-American bodies simply don't matter, and to the degree to which the U.S. is willing to do whatever it takes to secure its place and position in the world, and that includes a lot of really terrible things, utilizing the most powerful, highest funded military in the world. Now, that's not to say that I think that your efforts with MDMA are like, somehow making this all possible, that, please don't misconstrue it as that. But I think that by and large, when we talk about some of the medical research that's going on, it gets divorced from its social context. It gets divorced from its political context. Folks make statements about the counterculture of the 60s being a mistake, right? That it got wrapped up in the Cultural Revolution, that ultimately people who were part of the counterculture checked out. They didn't try to change things. They got, swept to the side. And I think that in statements like that, it sort of loses sight of the fact, it makes the implicit assertion that either, dissidents shouldn't have been engaged in psychedelic practice, or people taking psychedelics shouldn't have been engaged in dissident actions, because ultimately it meant that psychedelics weren't available to continue to hang out in the lab and be utilized in all these ways to engage with research. And ultimately, at the end of the day, right, psychedelics have to come back to functioning in society. They're woven into the fabric of society. They're going to have these ripples and shocks and after effects. And so I think that personally, I just feel that there's a lack of discourse around the way that this clinical research has these implications. And like I said, I really don't have any answers for this, but I would like to see some more discussion on it, and I think this is great. Thanks.